Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement, addressing many of the critical issues of our time. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I am joined by my esteemed co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. I am grateful to be hosted today by Camp Fowler in the Adirondacks in the state of New York. In the United Church of Christ, we have a green church program called Creation Justice Churches, and Camp Fowler recently became our first Creation Justice camp. They are doing amazing things here. In fact, they have a creation celebration this weekend where families will be coming together to celebrate God's creation and to learn how to care for God's creation. Of course, Michael, when we talk about caring for God's creation, it's about more than picking up trash on the side of the road. There is a bigger picture to what we're doing. Today, we're talking about some plans, some policy proposals. Why should we care about this? Let me introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll be speaking. Abigail Cipparone is the policy advocate for domestic issues for the United Church of Christ. She is based in our DC Advocacy office. She previously worked as the legislative director for Congressman Kwasi Mfume. She holds a bachelor's degree in ethnicity, race, and migration from Yale University. I recently had the opportunity to be with her as we visited the offices of Congress members in DC, and she rocked it. She knows what she is doing. Up next, we'll then have Rachel Cleetus, who is the policy director with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She has co-authored numerous reports and articles that have covered everything from how rising sea levels will affect coastal real estate to how the power sector can make deep carbon reductions. She has been quoted widely in the news outlets ranging from CNN to the Today Show to NPR and USA Today. And then finally, today we have with us Xavier Boatright, who is the Deputy Legislative Director for the Sierra Club on matters of clean energy and electrification. His professional career has covered a lot of rich, fertile, and sometimes rugged ground. He has worked as an environmental activist, a public school teacher, and as a player in the NFL. I know acronyms are confusing. That stands for National Football League. We are grateful to have all of you with us today, and we will let Abigail get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see some slides. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I am going to be giving a summary on how Project 2025 could impact our climate and threaten God's creation. So Project 2025 is a compilation of radical policy proposals and a presidential transition project that's launched by the Heritage Foundation. These policies threaten basic freedoms, punish the most vulnerable, dismantle the structure of our federal government, and attack religious freedom and the separation of church and state. From attacking overtime pay, student loans, and reproductive rights, to allowing more discrimination, pollution, and price gouging, this plan would undermine the quality of life for millions of Americans. Most importantly, Project 2025 stands in direct opposition to the UCC's values and work. So here's just some more information on the creation of Project 2025. Over 100 organizations authored the project, and over $10 million was spent to create it. And its central policy playbook, the Mandate for Leadership, is over 900 pages long. Project 2025 addresses this list of issues and many more. So if you'd like to see how the United Church of Christ stands in opposition to each of these policies created by Project 2025, you can take a look at the resource the United Church of Christ Office of Public Policy and Advocacy published, which will be sent as a link in the chat. In this resource, the DC office and the UCC national setting staff from around the country break down every part of the Mandate for Leadership and speak to how these policy proposals violate the UCC's call to build a just world for all. With relation to the climate, Project 2025 calls for shredding regulations to curb greenhouse gas pollution, dismantling almost every clean energy program in the federal government, and boosting the production of fossil fuels, which, as we all know, is the chief cause of planetary warming. And in contrast, the United Church of Christ has advocated for greater regulation and strong action at the federal level to combat the climate crisis. And this obviously includes our 2015 resolution that called for a rapid transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy by 2040. So let's drill down a little more on what this mandate for leadership says about climate change and how these policy proposals violate our faith and could rapidly accelerate this climate crisis. First, much of what the EPA does is tied to the endangerment finding, which requires the EPA to take action under the Clean Air Act to curb emissions. Project 2025, however, wants to establish a system to update this 2009 endangerment finding in a way that makes it much harder for the EPA to take measures to combat greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. The UCC has a resolution on the books mandating that we as people of faith must fight for clean air, and this policy proposal directly violates that commitment. Project 2025 also proposes to disband the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which would leave federal agencies unequipped to combat climate change, not to mention deprive scientists, businesses, and the public of key data. NOAA issues daily weather forecasts, severe storm warnings, and monitors the climate, manages fisheries, restores coastal environments, and supports marine commerce. Additionally, these reports have made important discoveries about the effects of climate change. NOAA's expertise is frequently relied on by other federal agencies, and disbanding it would be incredibly harmful. In 2003, the UCC passed a resolution committing its members and settings to responding to the unmet needs of those harmed by climate change and national disasters. And I know we're all thinking about that right now as Hurricane Milton bears down. And so this policy would make it that much harder for us to fulfill that commitment to help our neighbors in need. So as we know, the Inflation Reduction Act creates ambitious and expansive investment in climate action and infrastructure development, and is also a top target of Project 2025. Project 2025 advocates to shift climate-related IRA funds away from mission-based organizations with subject matter expertise and toward state regulatory entities. This would allow state leaders who may not be committed to climate sustainability, or even those who deny climate change altogether, to misuse funds in a way that would set back our climate goals. And finally, the groups behind the mandate for leadership want to conduct offshore and natural gas lease sales to the maximum extent permitted. This proposal would allow fossil fuel companies to drill down on more public lands and waters, undoing progress made by the current administration to decrease this harmful practice. So as a denomination that is called for aggressive climate action with the goal of becoming independent from fossil fuels by 2040, moving IRA funding away from the clean energy transition and expanding permitting for oil and gas drilling would only delay our goal. I know this is the tip of the iceberg, and I'm sure our other panelists will be able to use their expertise to really drill down on what Project 2025 means for the climate, but I wanted to give this overview to get us all started. So as we all know, the policies that Project 2025 supports are already becoming law across the country as climate change deniers seek to open this country to more drilling and less regulation. So if you'd like to take action and speak to Congress about your concerns as a person of faith and as an inhabitant in this cherished and sacred planet, you can take action on a number of climate advocacy goals by going to the UCC Action Center, where you will be able to write to your members of Congress and the administration in just one click. So I know that will be sent in the chat momentarily. You can also join our network of thousands of other United Church of Christ advocates from across the country who receive weekly alerts from our office on the work happening in DC, and help you get involved by calling, emailing, or tweeting at your elected officials. So you can also stay in touch with our Washington, D.C. office by social media. And thank you so much for joining this webinar. I know it's going to be an incredibly impactful one. I will pass it back and stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for getting us started, and we'll turn it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Thanks for creating the space for this important conversation. And Abigail, that was a really wonderful overview of a pretty terrible document. I just want to start by reiterating what this document does. You know, it's 900 plus pages, but at its core and throughout, it's basically a fundamental attack on the institutions, the governance, the equitable structures, the shared humanity that we have to hold as we're thinking of confronting any problem. It's not just climate change. We're not going to solve climate in a corner somewhere. These bedrock institutions and policies and governance structures are being attacked. I wrote a blog post about some of these aspects, and it's just a slice of what's in the document, and I just dropped it in the chat. But I wanted to pull out a few things to build on what Abigail shared. You know, for one thing, this document takes sort of broadside attack, launches broadside attacks against civil rights. Whether we're talking about the kinds of policies that we need to enact to set right decades of racism in our country that have led to very harmful outcomes for Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, folks who live in poverty. We know that there are structural factors that are reinforcing those harms, and climate change is just the latest layer on top of all those injustices. So when we're thinking about pollution from fossil fuels, this has been a long-standing, decades-long challenge, and we have environmental laws that the Environmental Protection Agency, its very mission is to enact. So what does Project 2025 try to do? It tries to eviscerate those very bedrock public health laws that the Environmental Protection Agency is empowered to, by Congress, do on our behalf. It's going after things like the endangerment finding, which is a key finding that the EPA did to show that global warming emissions are harmful to public health and the environment. Now, do we need any reaffirmation of that? Just watching these repeat hurricanes bearing down on communities in Florida and the Southeast, this is just the latest reminder of the here and now reality, the lived experiences around our country. So going after the endangerment finding and saying that it needs to be revisited, well, if we were to revisit it today, it would only echo more strongly that climate change is harmful to health. And it's basically more than 200 people have been killed just from Helene. And now we have this terrifying Milton bearing down on people. The document's also littered with a lot of misdirection and misinformation. They do this kind of smoke and mirrors thing where they say, we're not really dismantling NOAA, we're just privatizing this stuff, breaking the stuff apart, etc. But when you look at what the document does to NOAA in particular, this is a science agency that's providing the kind of science freely available, publicly accessible that helps keep people safe, not just in major disasters, but ahead of time. They give seasonal forecasts. This was supposed to be a very active hurricane season. They said that to us in May, and here we are. It keeps our economy humming. These kinds of weather reports are used by all kinds of private businesses as well. And the idea that you would break this agency down and then privatize its functions, you would just cut people off from the information that they desperately need. And even private sector companies are saying that that doesn't make sense. Then it uses words like woke agenda, climate fanaticism, climate alarmism. And this is the kind of, it just shows you, how misguided this document is, because it's taking very, very serious challenges that we are trying to confront and then reducing it to these silly sound bites. They don't want to face the problem. They're dismantling the solutions, but they don't want to acknowledge the problem. And then, there are places where it's literally, it's such an upside down world. So for example, one of the phrases there is stop the war on oil and natural gas. And they want to repeal everything that was in the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill around clean energy and climate resilient infrastructure. It's preposterous to think that there's a war on oil and gas. We are producing more oil and gas than ever. And in fact, the war is on our health and our well-being, and the fossil fuel industry's power, its political clout and its ability to continue to expand. That's what we have to challenge. That is the fundamental source of environmental injustices and the climate crisis. So again, just really upside down to what the reality is. There's so many places where you just kind of have this moment of this is ludicrous that this can even be said in a serious way. I'm sorry I'm getting so exercised, but it is a document that literally on every page you're thinking, what? And then in a year where we're heading into a very important international climate moment where we're watching terrible climate impacts unfold around the world, the United States is the biggest historical contributor to heat trapping emissions. And as Rev Malcolm and I know, our responsibility here in the United States, folks who care about climate justice, we need to uphold justice both domestically and internationally. And the United States has repeatedly failed to live up to a commitment to provide finance to help a clean energy transition and climate adaptation in other countries. And meanwhile, they're reeling. I mean, countries that have contributed nothing to heat trapping emissions, the most vulnerable countries in Africa, small island nations, are bearing the brunt of emissions that are coming largely from richer nations like the US. And so, when this document says that the Biden administration's extreme climate policies have worsened global insecurity and hunger, food insecurity, it's actually exactly upside down. It's our failure to curtail the climate crisis that is imposing all these harms. It's setting back development around the world. It's pushing millions of people back into poverty. So rather than step away, we have to live up to our responsibilities on the global stage as well. And maybe the final thing I would say is there's nothing about this document that has to come true. There is a better path, and you've just heard some of that from Abigail. The opportunity we have is to confront multiple problems at the same time. This transition to clean energy, it's good for our health. It will help address environmental injustices. It will create jobs. And yes, it will also help us confront the climate crisis. Investing in climate resilience, that's life-saving work. Let's get out ahead of these disasters instead of just picking up the pieces afterwards. And let's do at home and abroad what is our moral and ethical responsibility. So these are all opportunities to do better. And on the other side is a very dark vision and a dark future. So let's embrace the light. Let's go towards the path that will actually benefit everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. I like that phrase, embrace the light. We will now turn towards Xavier, who will also help us embrace some light.
Okay. So thank you for joining me today. I'm Xavier Boatright again, and today I'll be discussing some of the significant threats posed by Project 2025 to environmental justice, clean energy deployment, and building electrification efforts. My slides mostly are just pictures, but I'll be doing most of the talking here. I think my colleagues here today have done a good job providing an overview, so I'll be brief on that. But as far as the specifics on clean energy deployment and building electrification, one of the primary threats of Project 2025 is clean energy deployment. The focus on fossil fuel expansion risks setting back our progress in things that other folks have mentioned, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the billions of dollars in investments in clean energy there to meet climate goals, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure law. Moreover, Project 2025 may hinder building electrification initiatives like your energy efficiency, home retrofit upgrades, as well as weatherization and weatherization assistance. And these are critical to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We need a multi-pronged approach and a combination of clean energy and building electrification. Also, behavior changes from the consumer level all the way up to private sector and federal government. And I'll end this slide with also a rollback of federal buildings, and they could face delays in Project 2025 in adopting their own zero emissions technologies and strategies. And we feel at Sierra Club that the federal building should be leading by example for the rest of the country in terms of its clean energy and federal building electrification efforts. In this next slide, and in this portion, I want to talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. The Project 2025 poses threats to the Endangered Species Act and NEPA. These are cornerstone policies that protect our biodiversity and native animals, plant species, as well as weakening these acts could mean opening the door for more fossil fuel projects without considering the environmental and human impacts, especially in underserved communities. Sometimes these folks would term these as communities of least resistance, meaning communities that have the least amount of financial clout to lawyer up and push back on these types of projects, as well as communities who may be lacking the decision-making representation to apply pressure. I'd also say there are impacts in terms of reduction of monument protections, and Project 2025 could prioritize reducing protections for national monuments by promoting and supporting the reduction of land areas that were set aside by previous administrations for conservation purposes. And this could open up national monuments for industries like oil and gas and mining, which it could threaten the ecological integrity, but it could also vastly alter the cultural and recreational uses of the local community in those areas, specifically with things like eminent domain and the running of pipelines across folks' property without adequate notice or information as required by laws like NEPA. Also, I would say undermining environmental review is another key pillar of Project 2025, and this would reduce the level of environmental scrutiny applied to developments on or near national monuments, and this could accelerate the approvals for harmful industrial projects that are threats to public health without either gutting altogether are vastly reducing the opportunities for public participation in decision-making around these projects on public lands, as well as these fossil fuel-related projects in general. I'd also say, I know Reverend Malcolm mentioned the church speaking out and getting things like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And in these pictures here, you can see protesters protesting about the air we breathe from the old industrial days and from industrial pollution. And then the Clean Water Act, we actually had so much pollution, which some folks may be more aware than my account, in rivers in Ohio, where rivers started to burn, and they had accounts of burning rivers. And a more contemporary example we've seen in Flint, Michigan, and other states and municipalities and even rural communities like the community of Denmark, South Carolina, who have struggled with aging water infrastructure issues that have poisoned and polluted the community through lead pipes and other types of corrosion in their infrastructure. But I'd say another key concern in Project 2025 is the potential weakening of Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. These laws have been critical, and we've continued to strengthen and bolster these laws in protecting public health and ensuring that marginalized communities, which these marginalized communities are often exposed to higher levels of pollution, and these laws ensure that they are safeguarded. So rolling back these protections would exacerbate health risks in low-income communities, but definitely put wind behind the backs of those who want to run toxic industries through these communities. I'd say something way more prevalent, and my colleagues before me have spoke about, we're in the wake of Hurricane Milton right now. As we're having this, we're in a climate war. If I talk to my folks from Asheville, North Carolina, we have folks in the Carolinas, Florida, who's being hit again, Georgia, and around the Gulf, who are still recovering from Helene. And here we are, another round of hurricanes. And then I can't go without speaking about the heat wave that's out west right now. I've talked to folks in the Southwest, and it's unseasonably hot at this time, and they've been plagued by fires, as well as other events across the nation that have happened. But I'd say in Project 2025, around hurricane preparedness, climate resilience, and disaster recovery, another part of Project 2025's deregulatory push could also reduce the focus on climate resilience and our ability to adjust and get ready for these more frequent storm events, because we know they're coming, and especially those extreme weather events in high-risk areas like the Gulf, which we're looking at now, at the Gulf of Mexico, and the need for those robust protections and swift recovery efforts, because again, folks in the area are still recovering from Helene. And then I'd say Project 25's proposed cuts to things like flood insurance, disaster recovery efforts, FEMA, especially for small businesses, will leave communities like those in Florida who are facing Milton more vulnerable to these climate disasters. Without the protections, we could see devastating impacts to individuals and local economies. I'd say one of the, just as I wrap up, the impact on the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the largest investment in climate action in U.S. history, and among the largest investment in over nearly 100 years since President Roosevelt's New Deal. And the progress made through the IRA and incentivizing clean energy could be at risk. Project 2025's focus on deregulation and fossil fuel expansion threatens the federal support for clean energy and climate solutions. And this would also impact communities benefiting from clean energy rebates, tax incentives, as well as tax credits and rebates for everything from appliances to energy efficient efforts for windows, insulation, and circuitry, all the way up to your own community solar and wind-based clean energy generation in your community. This could really impact and gut those incentives that a lot of folks have benefited in this first round of IRA, and we're looking for folks to reap even more benefits in this next year. And in closing, I just say Project 2025 represents a clear and present threat to environmental justice and the progress that we've made thus far towards a sustainable and equitable future. And it's critical that we remain vigilant and push back on these efforts, and our work together to protect those communities from the worst impacts of climate change and promoting clean energy solutions really is on the hinge of us being knowledgeable about Project 2025 and what it is, and able to talk about it and advocate for better solutions and against these deregulatory actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier, and thank you to each of our panelists. Those were terrific presentations. We have some questions for you now. There's kind of two questions I'm going to put together and allow you to answer as you will. But in this moment, should we be thinking kind of, defensively, like, okay, what are we going to do to respond to this kind of onslaught of potential policies, or part of me is also at the same time wondering what's our playbook, right? What's the offensive strategy? I mean, it's sort of a separate issue, but I thought I would tuck that in as well, just to kind of be thinking holistically about what's best for us to be doing right now. And so any takes on those questions?
I mean, I think the first thing that we need to remember is that they may have written this all down, but this project has gone on for decades, right? And is something that is not just of the moment now. And I think the beauty of that is that there have been environmental advocates, faith-based advocates as well, that have been fighting on these issues, been fighting to address climate change, to have a more aggressive role by the federal government to address climate change for decades. And I think your point on instead of just defensively reacting to, but instead, putting forth our own policy priorities is always important. And I think that work is getting done. I think the beauty of this is that, sure, this is the first time, or at this moment it was written down, but this fight has been happening for decades and will continue to happen. And so I think my read of this is that every person on this webinar, every person that is getting this information should feel empowered that now we know exactly where they want to go. So then we also know where we want to go as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think this is a very insidious agenda that has been pushed forward for a long time. And at its core, it is going after universal principles of justice. So yes, there are many issues and agencies that are addressed here, including the Environmental Protection Agency, which is so crucial for safeguarding our public health. But it's even more than that. It's basically going after the very premise that there is a role for public policy and there is a role for good government, and it should be guided by the public interest, by the people's interest, not subservient to corporate interests, and starving public institutions of staffing and budgets is in itself a way that harms the public. Being anti-science, being anti-fact, does not keep anyone safer. So I think they're having it laid out, ironically, in this level of detail just allows you to see exactly what the playbook is. But I think rather than fight on their turf, what we need to be thinking about is what is the agenda that needs to move forward that will keep people safer, that will build thriving communities, that will make sure that people are not left behind, and that we are actually elevating the voices of communities that have often been marginalized in our society. That's the proactive agenda. That's the agenda that will actually create the cycle of shifting power to where it needs to be shifted so that we get better outcomes going forward. If we keep fighting the narrow fights, and if we think we can win in narrow ways, we will remain in this kind of dark, circumscribed space. We have to break through to a more transformative phase of our country, our nation.
Yeah, and I would just add to that to say just more education and mobilizing in your community, having the conversation when you can with folks. It may not be the thing that folks want to talk about all the time, but when you have an opening, having that dinner table conversation in your community, and finding like-minded folks and then getting them involved in your sources of information, and making sure you check the integrity of where you're getting information, because there's a lot of disinformation in Project 25 and circulating around Project 2025. So I'd make sure you're doing that. And then the other thing I would say with that is talking to your local decision makers, from your local government to your state government, all the way up to your congressional representatives, even if they may not be favorable to your stance. Making sure that they understand your opposition and that they have heard your opposition is also important in the long run of things, and just continue to develop a plan to counteract any misinformation, disinformation, or direct advocacy efforts by opposing forces in your community, making sure that you're fact checking and able to do things to respond to that.
Thank you for those informative responses. I want to focus in a little bit on the Inflation Reduction Act. I've had opportunity the past couple of weeks to travel in communities where most likely the members of Congress would be against the Inflation Reduction Act for those communities. And so some of the conversation was about, okay, what does advocacy look like in this context? Certainly a church that has had solar panels installed in the past year can say, "Oh, we've benefited from the Inflation Reduction Act." Uh, but but also, I'm also sort of wondering about some of the things we heard about when the Inflation Reduction Act was rolled out, that there's going to be battery plants and different communities across the country, and this might in some ways impact advocacy and what the members of Congress in that district think about these things. I mean, is that sort of a part of the advocacy conversation if I'm going to write or email or call my senator or representative's office? Is there some resource I can go to kind of like beef up what I'm going to say about, oh, this is how the Inflation Reduction Act has helped my community or something like that? Like what are some pointers for maybe for advancing and defending the Inflation Reduction Act?
I mean, I think I would say from an advocacy standpoint, a lot of times people who are supportive of oil, greater drilling in oil and fossil fuels will say it's for our energy security and energy independence. I think that is a message that is bopped around the hill a lot when we talk about, when they try to argue the importance of fossil fuels. And I think that exact same message is actually the whole point of the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act, through its clean energy programs, helps us get to that energy independence, helps our national security by making it so we are not dependent on foreign oil. So we are not dependent on sources outside of the country. In fact, it shores up our clean energy abilities inside of the country. It allows us to access clean energy in a way that does not force us to rely on fossil fuels. And so I know that message has helped here on the Hill, and I think it can help when people are speaking to their members in their districts to emphasize that energy independence doesn't necessarily mean dependence on fossil fuels. Energy independence can also mean a clean energy future, and getting us there is what the Inflation Reduction Act is all about.
Yeah, I would also just there is now ample data. The White House is tracking, where money is being spent around this country, and there is a lot of data to show that the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act are flowing to every part of this country. Wherever you are in this country, there is an opportunity to benefit from either the Inflation Reduction Act or the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And that does not mean that the job is done. So here's the reality. There was also a commitment to Justice 40, and we are still at the front end of making sure that money and those investments are going to the communities who deserve them. So it's both sort of looking at the track record, but also recognizing that we're in the early stages of implementation. There's a lot more benefit that can and should flow, and it should flow in the right way. So being vigilant, making sure resources, including technical resources, are available so that communities can apply for the funding that they deserve, that is theirs to access. I think also just recognizing that whenever these kinds of major investments flow out into the country, it's an opportunity also to think about connecting not just national solutions, but what does your community need? And that can look a little bit different in different parts of the country. So engaging in that conversation directly. And this should not be political. This is about access to clean energy that can save you money as a consumer, energy efficiency, that can improve your health, reduce the cumulative burden of pollution in your community. So let's stop pulling all of this into political partisan spaces. This is about very basic benefits that we all need and deserve.
Yeah, and I just briefly say the Inflation Reduction Act has deployed billions of dollars towards clean energy investments, as well as meeting our climate goals. And in that deployment, there are things that have been mentioned, like the executive order on environmental justice, as well as Justice 40 initiative. And the government also has different contractors that is contracted to help folks navigate those, and TIC-TACs and technical assistance. And I know there may be some inconsistencies from state to state, but make sure that you engage in the process as you have the capacity to do, because that ultimately is what helps move it and inform it. And if you feel there's not enough adequate opportunities for engagement, then make sure you reach out to like the local nonprofits like the Sierra Club or someone like that, who may be able to apply pressure to give you more opportunity to weigh in, because there are accessibility issues and things like that can be hard to qualify when you're drafting a legislation. It's just words on the paper until you implement it. But in the true implementation, it's your feedback that I've seen the federal government adjust to, that truly makes sure that it gets to the right folks.
Great. Thank you for those responses. We have a question from the audience that really directs our attention to the global context. This is there's a global need to shift away from fossil fuels to clean energy. Can you say something about sort of next month we have a UN COP, and how does this fit into that conversation? Does this relate to the Paris Climate Agreement and so forth? What might you have to say about that?
Yeah, as many of you know, of course, confronting the climate crisis is going to require global action. No one nation can do this on their own, but the U.S. has a really important responsibility and capacity to contribute to solutions. And this year, we're in a moment where there are two major priorities, and I just dropped a blog post in there that laid out some of those priorities. One, this is the year that countries are negotiating climate finance to help all countries make the clean energy transition and adapt to climate change. So that is one of the big priorities. The other is countries voluntarily commit to emission reduction commitments. And by February 2025, countries are being asked to re-up new commitments for 2035. The United States had committed to cutting its emissions approximately in half below 2005 levels by 2030. And now the question is, how much further can we go by 2035? How can we build on the progress of the Inflation Reduction Act, vehicle standards, power plant standards, and go further? And so both those things are going to be crucial for us to put pressure here on the US to do better and live up to its responsibilities. But the other piece is we're in a moment where geopolitics, it's a scary world out there, and there is a real concern about multilateral organizations and their ability to deliver peace, security, confront climate change, confront global challenges. And I think it's sometimes easy in moments of crisis to turn insular. And it's so important to rise above, because we know that narrow self-interest will never help us break through to a fairer, more just world for everyone. So to see that shared humanity, to be those voices that say, yes, we need to take care of our own house, but we cannot sacrifice other people's houses in the process. So how can we build that connection from the global south to the Gulf South, as some of our environmental justice partners have said? That's what we have to do, because otherwise you will always have the rich and the elite who are running the show everywhere and in their interest, while the rest of us are kind of left to deal with the consequences. So if we can find that shared goal, boost the multilateral processes like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we can build a fairer, better world.
And I don't have a good answer for how to solve the global global conflicts, but in terms of thinking about clean energy and the difference between clean energy from the source, and even Rachel talking about the elite just now. I mean, you think about what type of people own oil and oil reserves, and somehow we've monetized oil and coal and like coal mining. There's these like kings of coal of folks. There's these elite folks who have created $1 billion industry off of monetizing natural resources. And when you think about and that's been leveraged as tools in war. We've seen that in Russia with gas and stuff, and how they've cut neighboring countries off. And so that monetizing of that natural resource has been used as a tool in war. But when you think about clean energy, and especially the United States leading in clean energy and leading by example, who's charging? The creator's not charging us for rays of light from the sun. It's kind of hard to monetize that. I'm going to bottle up the sun. And also like gusts of wind. It take a lot to block a nation's wind pattern so that they can't get wind. So I think that is one of the linings there between like fossil fuel generation and being used as a tool of war versus our need to get on clean energy. And I think some European countries like Germany, who have deployed a lot of solar, have been able to display some level of independence despite external conflict because of the amount of clean energy like solar that they've deployed on their within their borders.
Yeah, and I will just say thank you so much for all of that incredible information. And if you are in the DC area and you want to get involved with the upcoming COP negotiations, you can actually join a prayer vigil that the United Church of Christ is co-hosting with the Washington Interfaith Staff Coalition to urge the U.S. to boldly lead in curbing our climate emissions when they go to this very important event. So I'm going to post some information in the chat if you'd like to get involved, but thank you.
Thank you for that. We have a question in the audience that is sort of about what does a just transition look like in this context that we're talking about, or maybe for some of us, what is a just transition? Just kind of give an overview of that, and also there's a lot of claims about jobs, what creates jobs and what doesn't, and so if one of you could kind of shine some light on how we can understand jobs claims when it comes to the fossil fuel industry or the renewable energy industry. What do we need to know?
Well, I could start with just what a just transition is, or at least in my own words. A just transition is where when we make a transition, I know the Sierra Club has touted and done a lot of work to close and retire coal plants because of the threats to public health, as well as it's one of the most expensive ways to produce power. But in that, there's a just transition phase where you have to ensure that we don't just shut these coal plants down and tell the community to go figure it out. We also consider the job loss, and how do we replace those jobs? How do we retrain those folks for the innovation and newer jobs and where the energy sector is going? And then I'd say just transition is the meaningful engagement of the neighboring community, local government, tribes, and the cultural and recreational involvement of an area when you shut down a facility, or when you're making a transition from old to new in terms of innovation, and making sure that they're a part of that. And historically, a lot of folks have shut down facilities. We've seen with mills, towns, and things where they just shut it down and tell the community to go figure it out. Just transition gives us an opportunity to make sure that people have a way to go and a place to go, and that we're not just throwing them out on the street. But then there's also, of course, I'm representing the Sierra Club, there's environmental remediation associated with just transition, because sometimes folks just shut something down and leave a bunch of waste there, and then it's left as a brownfield site or a Superfund site for the government or for the local or federal government to deal with, instead of the culprit who caused the pollution in the first place. So I say it's taking the time to have the meaningful stakeholder and community engagement to ensure that that the way that we transition is aligned with the community and the stakeholders who are most directly impacted.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that is exactly right. And maybe the thing I would add, and in a big picture kind of way, is when we're thinking about moments where there's a big change that's happening in the economy and in people's lives. As a nation, we can't leave individuals or individual communities who happen to be on the front lines of those changes to deal with it on their own. If we think this is a national priority, then let's treat it that way. And one particular challenge we have in the United States is the widening wealth inequality that continues to make many, many working people feel very precarious in their day-to-day, their access to health, their access to childcare, their access to affordable housing. And all of that makes it very difficult when you then tell them, and then the only job you thought you had in town is going to go away when that facility, that fossil fuel facility closes. And the fossil fuel industry weaponizes that again and again. And that's what we have to understand. The big picture that's going on here is we're eroding the standard of living for working people again and again. We're giving big tax breaks to the wealthy. We're continuing to prioritize the interests of the fossil fuel industry. There's more of us than them. And that's why we need a kind of, the just transition to me is about really an economic system that's just, that delivers outcomes that allow for a healthier future, not just in one sector or in one part of the economy, but across the board. So people don't feel that sense of fear, frankly, for themselves and their children. So whether you're talking about affordable housing, which should be a big push, climate resilient, clean energy, affordable housing for people who are living in areas that are exposed to climate risks, everything from that to making education affordable, making childcare accessible is what will move us to be able to transition in a just way away from fossil fuels. These are all connected.
Great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are coming near the end of our time. I've got one question from the audience that I have to put out there because we have such a rich gathering here with the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Sierra Club and Abigail from the UCC's DC office. Question is, are there examples or ways of church communities could advocate and partner with community organizations to raise the voice of environmental justice? And I just must say one word of celebration here and Thanksgiving for the Sierra Club, because that's how I got into the climate justice movement, was as a pastor of a church, founding a Beyond Coal chapter in a successful campaign to close down a coal plant in the state of Washington. And that's sometimes lifted up as an example of a just transition because of the agreements made to make that happen. But and the Sierra Club led the way on there, and so always grateful for that. A special place in my heart for the Sierra Club for that. But what are your thoughts here from those of you on our panel about opportunities for collaboration or examples of things you've seen of collaboration to make environmental justice happen?
Yeah, thanks for the shout out and thanks for your work, Reverend Brooks, with the Beyond Coal efforts. I would say some of the things that church congregations can do. First and foremost, we need the faith-based community in these efforts, in our advocacy efforts. We really do. The faith-based community as a whole is a source and point of integrity in terms of information in a world where we live in with disinformation is so rampant. It is an area of integrity for especially environmental justice communities. I would also say, just like how I told you to have conversations about these issues with your local elected officials, also having these conversations with your faith-based clergy and your leaders on the faith-based side, and then finding out about local groups like the Sierra Club and others, Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS, and folks who are doing this work in your community. And then if you don't know of anyone doing this work in your community, I think there are folks here in this quorum that can help connect you. We've got extensive networks, but I'd say also making sure you have that conversation internally with the church, because The church can be an influential motivator and movement leader in there, but it also can serve as a place of organizing. I think ever since going back to the civil rights movement, a lot of these things start in the church. So I'd say making sure that your religious clergy are on board and they understand the issues just as well as your external collaboration with groups who are leading on the issues. And we should be able to work together.
Yeah, just 100% echo all that. You have very powerful voices. You have moral authority. You have facts. You have networks. You are often doing mutual aid in your communities. There is nothing more powerful than what you're bringing to this very, very important broader national conversation. I think sometimes we minimize our ability to shift, and it's really that conversation, talking one-on-one with people, including people who don't agree with us. I mean, we have to find ways to have these conversations across divides and reduce the fracturing and have more healing in our society. So yes, absolutely, UCF is always happy to be a resource. We have lots of maps, data, projections around climate science. Happy to advocate together. It's really powerful to take delegations up to your local district offices or in DC to advocate around shared priorities, and happy to hold up examples. You're installing solar panels, that's fantastic. Let's feature those stories, make sure they get out there more so that people see them as attractive opportunities.
Yeah, and I'll just finish with a plug for any members of the UCC that are on the call. If you or your church would like to come to DC, organize a lobby day with our DC office, we can do that. We can set up meetings with your members, and we can make sure that your voice is amplified at the federal level. And if you want resources for district level meetings, we're also happy to provide that too. So just know that you have friends and partners on this call who are excited to do the work with you, however you see fit.
Thank you, Abigail, for that. And I'll just say, bring your children and your youth to DC. That's we've had some wonderful experiences of that in advocacy. And beautiful to see. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's been terrific to have all of you here. And I must say, I'm looking at who's in our audience today, and we have really some leaders from the environmental justice movement that I'm grateful to have join us. Claire McClinton, so great to see you here. Leslie Fields, so wonderful to see you. Really leaders here in the field with us today. So we want to thank you for your work and your being with us today. And thank you to all of our audience for the advocacy that you do and making a difference in your community. We'll look forward to being with you again next month as we will focus on the United Nations climate gathering. We'll be focusing on that next month with some terrific speakers. So until then, God bless each of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.